The mess hall of Nexus Academy fell into its usual uncomfortable silence when Cadet Jennifer Holland entered. She moved with the deliberate grace of someone who had learned to make every gesture count, her dark hair pulled back in regulation style, revealing the thin scar that traced along her left temple and disappeared behind her ear. The alien cadets tracked her movement with the kind of fascination reserved for dangerous predators in captivity. At the Zephyrian table, 4 tall, blue-skinned beings with elongated skulls and silver eyes whispered among themselves in their musical language. Their translator implants rendered their words into standard galactic. The human female, always alone. Their leader, Cadet Veltar, had earned top marks in tactical studies, but still regarded humans as an evolutionary accident that somehow achieved spaceflight. The Kraknari delegation occupied the corner booth, their massive, crab-like forms requiring specially reinforced seating. Their chitinous shells gleamed under the artificial lighting, and their compound eyes tracked every movement in the room with predatory precision. To them, humans were soft, weak mammals whose only notable trait was their inexplicable persistence in surviving situations that should have killed them centuries ago. Near the viewing ports, a cluster of ethereal collective members floated in their mobility harnesses, their translucent forms shimmering like heat mirages. They communicated through bioluminescent patterns that danced across their skin, discussing the human with the detached curiosity of scientists observing a particularly interesting specimen. In their vast telepathic network, humans registered as primitive creatures whose emotions created an uncomfortable static in the mental space. Jennifer collected her protein synthesis ration and nutrient paste, the Academy's attempt at accommodating human dietary requirements, and found an empty table near the center of the hall. She ate methodically, seemingly unaware of the attention focused on her, though her peripheral vision cataloged every alien present and their positioning with the automatic assessment of someone trained for survival. The whispers grew louder as more species joined the speculation. The Luminari, beings of pure energy contained within crystalline shells, hummed their theories in frequencies that made the metal walls vibrate softly. The hive-born, insectoid creatures who moved in perfect synchronization clicked their mandibles in patterns that conveyed their collective confusion about human individuality. Fascinating specimen, is she not? The voice belonged to Professor Kethmore, a Zephyrian instructor whose age was measured in centuries. His silver eyes held the depth of someone who had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations, yet humans remained an enigma that challenged his understanding of evolutionary logic. Indeed, Professor. Veltar's response carried the confidence of youth combined with genetic superiority complex, though I fail to understand why the Academy continues to accept human applications. Their physical limitations are obvious, their technology primitive, and their emotional instability makes them unsuitable for serious diplomatic or military roles. The Kraknari delegate, warrior cadet Thexalon, shifted his massive bulk with a sound like grinding stone. His translated voice emerged as a deep rumble. Their kind should have been extinct millennia ago. Weak bones, vulnerable skin, short lifespan, limited sensory capabilities, yet somehow they persist. One of his clawed appendages gestured dismissively toward Jennifer. This one barely passed the physical requirements. Her species lacks the basic adaptations for survival in hostile environments. What none of them could see from their positions was the way Jennifer's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, or how her left hand, the one bearing a collection of small scars across the knuckles, formed a brief fist before relaxing. She had endured 3 months of similar conversations, always spoken just loudly enough for her to hear, always delivered with the casual certainty of beings who had never questioned their place in the galactic hierarchy. The Academy's integrated approach to education meant that cadets from dozens of species trained together, studying everything from xenobiology to combat tactics, from diplomatic protocol to survival techniques. The theory was sound. Mutual understanding would lead to better cooperation in the field. The reality was more complex, with ancient prejudices and evolutionary pride creating invisible barriers that even the most advanced educational techniques struggled to overcome. Near the end of her meal, Jennifer reached up to brush a strand of hair from her face, revealing more clearly the mark that had drawn so much attention. It wasn't just a scar. The careful observer might notice how it curved with deliberate precision, too clean to be accidental, too specific to be random violence. The skin around it held a slightly different texture, as if something had burned or frozen the flesh during its creation. The ethereal collective members pulsed with synchronized curiosity, their bioluminescent communication creating a light show of questions and theories. Through their translator interfaces, fragments of their discussion leaked into audible range: ritual marking, territorial display, combat trophy. Their collective consciousness couldn't process the concept of individual achievement through violence, making human warfare particularly incomprehensible to their pacifist philosophy. As Jennifer finished eating and prepared to leave, Cadet Veltar stood from his table. His impressive height of nearly 8 feet made him tower over most species in the hall, and his ceremonial ranking insignia marked him as one of the most accomplished cadets in his year. The silver threading in his uniform indicated noble birth within Zephyrian society, adding social authority to his academic achievements. "Human," he called, his melodic voice carrying easily across the now silent mess hall. "We have been discussing your decoration." The way he pronounced the last word made it clear he considered it primitive vanity rather than anything meaningful. Jennifer paused in her movements, her body language shifting in a way that made the more observant aliens take unconscious steps backward. It wasn't an obvious change. Her posture remained relaxed, her expression neutral, but something in the quality of her stillness suggested a predator evaluating threats rather than a student processing social interaction. "My decoration?" She turned to face him fully, and several cadets noted how she positioned herself with clear lines of movement to multiple exits. "You mean this?" Her finger traced along the scar with casual familiarity. "Indeed." Veltar approached with the confident stride of someone accustomed to deference. "Among my people, such markings typically indicate either punishment for transgression or membership in the lower castes who engage in manual labor. I am curious which category applies to your situation, as it would help explain your presence here." The insult was delivered with perfect diplomatic courtesy, wrapped in the language of academic inquiry. Around the hall, other cadets leaned forward with anticipation. Confrontations between species were rare at the academy, but when they occurred, they provided valuable insight into interspecies dynamics, data that would prove useful in their future careers. Thexalon's compound eyes focused on the exchange with predatory interest. In Kraknari culture, challenges were resolved through ritual combat, and the massive warrior cadet found human reluctance to engage in physical confrontation both puzzling and contemptible. His claws tapped against the reinforced floor in a rhythm that other Kraknari recognized as anticipation. The hive-born collective tilted their heads in perfect unison, their shared consciousness analyzing the interaction through the lens of their highly ordered society. Individual conflict was alien to their experience, making human behavior as incomprehensible as it was fascinating. Their mandibles clicked in soft harmonic patterns that conveyed confusion mixed with scientific curiosity. Jennifer smiled, and several aliens later reported that the expression contained more menace than most threat displays they had encountered. "Punishment and manual labor," she repeated thoughtfully. "Interesting interpretations. I suppose in some ways you're not entirely wrong." Her response caused a ripple of confusion through the gathered cadets. The expected reactions would have been anger, submission, or clarification. Instead, she seemed to be treating Veltar's insult as the beginning of a more complex conversation, one whose direction remained unclear. "However," she continued, taking a step closer to the towering Zephyrian, You might want to consider a third option. The scar seemed more prominent now, the artificial lighting casting small shadows that emphasized its deliberate precision. Professor Kethmore moved closer, his centuries of experience recognizing the subtle signs of an interaction that was about to exceed normal parameters. Academy regulations were clear about physical confrontations between cadets, but the psychological dynamics were more complex, particularly when they involved species with vastly different evolutionary backgrounds. And what option would that be? Human? Veltar's silver eyes held amused condescension. In his worldview, humans were barely above the level of clever animals, capable of mimicking advanced behavior but lacking the genetic foundation for true excellence. This conversation was merely an opportunity to demonstrate that superiority to the other species present. The mess hall had fallen completely silent now, with even the ambient noise of the ventilation systems seeming muted. The various alien species watched with the fascination of observers at a ritual whose meaning remained opaque, but whose significance was undeniable. Jennifer reached the end of her stride directly in front of Veltar, close enough that the height difference became almost comical. She tilted her head back to meet his gaze, her expression shifting into something that made the ethereal collective's bioluminescent communication flicker with alarm. "The third option," she said quietly, her voice carrying just far enough for the closest observers to hear, "is that some marks aren't about being marked by others." Her finger traced the scar again, slower this time. "Sometimes they're about marking yourself with what you've done." The silence stretched for several heartbeats as the implications of her words registered with varying degrees of comprehension across the different species present. The concept of self-modification for symbolic purposes existed in some cultures, but the specific context remained unclear. Veltar's expression shifted from condescension to puzzlement. In Zephyrian society, physical modification was either medicinal, functional, or indicated social status assigned by others. The idea of deliberately scarring oneself as a form of personal record-keeping was foreign to his experience. "What you've done," he repeated, his melodic voice losing some of its assured tone. "Are you suggesting this mark represents some achievement worthy of permanent commemoration?" The question sparked renewed interest among the observing cadets. Achievement was a concept every species understood, though the criteria varied significantly across cultures. If the human was claiming the scar represented accomplishment rather than punishment or accident, the implications were worth exploring. Jennifer's smile widened slightly, and this time even the Kraknari warrior cadet shifted uneasily in his reinforced seat. There was something in her expression that suggested knowledge of violence that went beyond theoretical study or training simulations. "You could say that," she replied, "though achievement might not be the word I'd use." The Academy's central courtyard served as a gathering space between classes, with carefully maintained atmospheric processors creating comfortable conditions for the dozen most common species. Benches and rest areas were designed to accommodate everything from the Zephyrians' tall frames to the grounders' preference for direct contact with synthetic earth materials. In the center, a holographic display showed the current roster of cadets from across the galaxy, their academic standings updated in real time. Word of the mess hall confrontation had spread with the efficiency that only institutional gossip could achieve. By the time afternoon classes began, cadets from every species were aware that something significant had occurred between the human female and the Zephyrian noble. The details varied depending on the source and the translation capabilities of different species, but the core elements remained consistent. A challenge had been issued, a mysterious response had been given, and the human had departed without providing clarification. Cadet Zaraneth, a member of the crystalline shard people, created harmonic resonances that conveyed her confusion to her cluster mates. Her species communicated through sound frequencies that could shatter glass at the wrong amplitude, making their thoughts literally crystalline clear to each other. The human's response pattern indicates knowledge structures we lack context for understanding. Her confidence markers were authentic, not defensive posturing. The Void Walkers, beings who existed partially in normal space and partially in dimensions that most species couldn't perceive, flickered between states as they discussed the incident. Their translator implants struggled with their non-linear communication style, producing fractured sentences that somehow conveyed meaning. Time scars, violence echoes, human remembering, dangerous, beautiful, terrible. In the Academy's training facility, Instructor Gralek, a massive Titan-born whose species had evolved on a high-gravity world with predators that made ancient Earth dinosaurs look like pets, reviewed combat training schedules while considering the implications of the morning's events. His 4 eyes, each adapted for different types of vision, had observed enough human behavior to recognize patterns that other species missed. Unlike his colleagues who viewed humans as evolutionary curiosities, Gralek had served in border conflicts where human military units had been present. He had witnessed firsthand their capacity for violence when properly motivated, their ability to function effectively despite physical limitations, and their disturbing tendency to view certain types of trauma as strengthening rather than debilitating experiences. The afternoon's tactical analysis class found itself dominated by discussion of the incident, despite Professor Athara's attempts to maintain focus on the scheduled curriculum. The symmetrical ones, who existed in perfect mathematical harmony and considered disorder a form of spiritual pollution, created geometric patterns with their movements that expressed their distress at incomplete information. The human's behavior pattern deviates from established models, Professor Athara observed, her 6-armed form gesturing with the precision her species was known for. Standard psychological profiles indicate humans respond to social challenges through emotional expression, submission displays, or escalation patterns. Cadet Holland demonstrated none of these responses. Veltar sat in the front row, his earlier confidence replaced by something approaching intellectual curiosity. Among his people, unsolved puzzles were considered intellectually stimulating rather than frustrating, and the human's cryptic response had created exactly the type of mental challenge that Zephyrian culture valued. Perhaps, he suggested, the mark represents participation in one of their primitive combat rituals. Human cultures include numerous traditions involving physical contests that their kind mistakes for meaningful achievement. The suggestion drew immediate response from Thexalon, whose massive form dominated the specialized seating designed for Kraknari physiology. Combat markings follow established patterns: victory scars, defeat markers, ritual participation indicators. This marking matches none of those categories. His clawed appendage gestured dismissively. If it represented combat achievement, it would be displayed prominently for status purposes, not hidden beneath hair covering. What neither of them mentioned, though both had observed, was the way other humans in the academy had reacted to seeing Jennifer's scar. The few human cadets present had displayed recognition rather than curiosity, suggesting the mark held significance within their cultural context that translated poorly to other species' understanding. The chorus singers, beings whose entire species existed as living symphonies, had detected something in Jennifer's vocal patterns that their translation systems couldn't properly convey. Their harmonic discussion filled the classroom with sounds like crystal chimes mixed with distant thunder, expressing concepts that existed at the intersection of memory, pain, and pride. The human's vocalization contained harmonic structures indicating deep time connections, their representative explained through the translation interface. Not recent experience, old experience, experience that changed her fundamental resonance patterns. Dr. Keshala, the Academy's chief xenopsychologist, entered the classroom as the discussion reached its peak intensity. Her species, the Mind Weavers, had evolved psychological analysis as a primary survival trait, making them exceptionally skilled at reading the mental states of other beings. Her appearance immediately shifted the classroom dynamic, as cadets from every species recognized her expertise in understanding cross-cultural behavioral patterns. "I see we're discussing the morning's social interaction," she observed, her telepathic abilities allowing her to sample the surface thoughts of the various species present. "How many of you have considered that your interpretive frameworks might be insufficient for understanding human behavioral markers?" The question created uncomfortable silence. Academy training emphasized the importance of cross-species understanding, but most cadets relied on their own cultural contexts when analyzing alien behavior. The possibility that human psychology operated according to principles that didn't translate effectively was intellectually disturbing. "Doctor," Veltar began, his melodic voice carefully respectful, "are you suggesting that human scarification practices have meanings that exist outside normal cultural categories?" "I'm suggesting," Dr. Keshala replied, settling into her specialized mobility apparatus, "that humans have evolutionary experiences that most species lack. Your people, Cadet Veltar, developed on a world where the primary threats were environmental rather than biological. Your society evolved cooperation as a survival strategy. Humans developed on a world where almost everything was trying to kill them, including other humans." The classroom stirred uneasily as the implications registered. Most galactic species had achieved sapience through social cooperation, technological advancement, or specialization that reduced direct conflict. The idea of intelligence emerging from a context of constant violence was both fascinating and deeply unsettling. Thexalon's compound eyes focused intently on the professor. "Are you suggesting that human psychological development is fundamentally based on trauma response patterns?" "I'm suggesting that what you might interpret as trauma, humans might experience as education." Dr. Keshala's mental presence brushed against each student's awareness, allowing them to sense rather than simply hear her words. For most species, survival threats are external problems to be solved through cooperation and technology. For humans, survival threats were often other humans, making individual capability a primary adaptation. The ethereal collective members pulsed with disturbed bioluminescence, their shared consciousness recoiling from concepts that contradicted their fundamental assumptions about intelligent development. The idea that sapience might emerge from violence rather than transcending it challenged their most basic philosophical foundations. "This would explain the human female's behavioral anomalies," observed one of the symmetrical ones, their mathematical mind processing the new information through geometrical frameworks. "If conflict experience is valued rather than avoided, then physical markers indicating successful navigation of dangerous situations would serve as status indicators rather than trauma reminders." The insight sparked a cascade of reconsideration throughout the classroom. Species that had dismissed human capabilities as evolutionary inadequacy began to recognize that their evaluation criteria might be fundamentally inappropriate. If humans had evolved to thrive in conditions that would destroy most other species, then their apparent limitations might actually represent specialized adaptations. As the class period drew to a close, Professor Ithara attempted to return focus to the scheduled curriculum. "While this discussion has been illuminating, we must return to our tactical analysis exercises. Tomorrow's simulation will require—" "Professor," interrupted a voice from near the back of the classroom. The speaker was Cadet Jorik of the Stone Shepherds, a species known for their methodical patience and reluctance to engage in speculation. If human conflict adaptation is as significant as Dr. Keshala suggests, should we not understand these patterns before engaging in joint tactical exercises? The question resonated through the classroom with uncomfortable logic. Joint exercises formed a crucial part of academy training, designed to teach cadets how to function effectively with alien team members. If human behavioral patterns operated according to principles that other species didn't understand, the potential for dangerous misunderstandings multiplied exponentially. Dr. Keshala's mental presence conveyed approval, mixed with concern. Cadet Jorik raises an important point. Human behavior in stress situations often confuses other species precisely because they interpret survival responses as either aggression or breakdown, when in fact they may represent optimal performance under pressure. The implications rippled through the classroom as each species processed the concept through their own evolutionary frameworks. For beings whose survival depended on cooperation, individual excellence in violence was both incomprehensible and threatening. For species whose conflicts were ritualized or technological, the human capacity for personal, immediate, deadly force represented a form of chaos that challenged their understanding of civilized behavior. As cadets filed out of the classroom, conversations continued in dozens of languages and communication methods. The human female's scarred confidence had become more than idle gossip. It represented a fundamental challenge to their assumptions about intelligence, civilization, and the relationship between individual capability and social value. The Academy's combat training facilities were designed to accommodate the physical requirements and fighting styles of multiple species simultaneously. Gravity generators could create fields ranging from the crushing pressure preferred by the Titan-born to the near weightlessness that allowed the drift dancers their aerial combat techniques. Atmospheric processors maintained breathable environments for oxygen breathers while providing isolated chambers for species requiring different gas mixtures. Late evening training sessions were typically reserved for advanced students working on specialized techniques or cadets requiring additional instruction to meet minimum standards. Tonight, however, an unusual crowd had gathered in the observation galleries overlooking the main training floor. Word had spread that human Cadet Holland was scheduled for combat assessment, and curiosity about her mysterious scar had drawn spectators from across the academy. Instructor Gralek stood at the control station, his 4 eyes monitoring multiple displays that tracked biometric data, environmental conditions, and safety parameters. His massive frame dwarfed even the Kraknari delegates, and his presence commanded immediate attention from every species in the facility. Unlike many of his colleagues, he had requested this assignment specifically to observe human combat behavior under controlled conditions. Tonight's assessment will evaluate individual combat capability against multiple threat types, he announced, his voice carrying easily through the facility's acoustic systems. Cadet Holland will face 3 scenarios: single opponent, multiple opponents, and environmental hazard response. Standard Academy safety protocols are in effect. In the preparation area, Jennifer performed final equipment checks with the methodical precision of someone whose life had depended on such attention to detail. The Academy's training gear was designed to prevent serious injury while still providing realistic feedback. Impacts were absorbed and distributed, blade weapons were force-limited, and emergency medical systems monitored vital signs continuously. What the observing aliens couldn't see was how her fingers automatically traced weapon balance points, checked armor joint flexibility, and cataloged potential improvised weapons from the training equipment scattered around the preparation area. Her movements carried the unconscious competence of someone for whom violence was a practical skill rather than theoretical knowledge. In the observation gallery, Veltar had claimed a prominent position that allowed him to observe both the training floor and his fellow spectators' reactions. His earlier encounter with the human had challenged assumptions he hadn't realized he held, and tonight's demonstration might provide answers to questions he was still learning to ask. "Curious that so many have chosen to observe tonight," commented Professor Kethmore, his silver eyes reflecting the facility's lighting. "One might almost suspect that our human colleague has generated unusual interest among the student body." Thexalon's massive form occupied a specially reinforced section of the gallery, his compound eyes tracking every movement on the training floor with predatory focus. Human combat training lacks the ritual elements that provide meaning to warrior development. Crude efficiency without honor or artistic expression. This will demonstrate their fundamental inadequacy for serious military application. The ethereal collective members floated in their mobility harnesses, their translucent forms shimmering with bioluminescent patterns that conveyed skeptical anticipation. Their telepathic network buzzed with theories and predictions, most of which centered on expected human emotional responses to physical stress. Dr. Keshala arrived as the first scenario began initializing, her mental presence immediately sampling the emotional atmosphere in the observation area. The mixture of curiosity, condescension, and underlying tension suggested that tonight's assessment had implications beyond simple academic evaluation. Scenario 1. Single opponent engagement, Gralek announced. Opponent type, Kraknari warrior form combat construct. Difficulty setting, intermediate. The training floor's holographic projectors created a realistic environment resembling a space station corridor, complete with emergency lighting and obstacles that could provide cover or present hazards. From the far end, a construct matching Kraknari physiology but lacking true intelligence began advancing toward Jennifer's position. The artificial warrior stood nearly 10 feet tall, its chitinous shell gleaming under the emergency lighting, multiple limbs ending in clawed appendages that could tear through standard armor plating. Advanced combat algorithms governed its behavior, providing tactical intelligence without the unpredictability of living consciousness. What happened next would be discussed in academy corridors for months afterward. Instead of retreating to cover or attempting to maintain distance, the tactics most species would employ when facing a larger, stronger opponent, Jennifer moved directly toward the construct. Not with the reckless charge that some aliens might have expected from human emotionality, but with the calculated aggression of someone who understood that the best defense against overwhelming force was often to collapse the distance before that force could be brought to bear effectively. Her movement pattern confused the observing aliens because it violated their assumptions about logical combat behavior. The construct was stronger, better armored, and equipped with natural weapons that should have made close combat suicidal. Instead, Jennifer treated proximity as an advantage rather than a liability. The engagement lasted less than 30 seconds. Using the construct's momentum against it, she guided its charge into a wall obstacle, simultaneously positioning herself where its primary weapons couldn't reach effectively. Her training weapon found joint gaps in its artificial armor with precision that suggested extensive knowledge of Kraknari anatomy. The construct's behavioral algorithms, designed to simulate warrior intelligence, couldn't adapt quickly enough to combat techniques that prioritized disabling opponents over honorable engagement. Scenario 1 complete, Gralek announced, though his voice carried a note of interest that hadn't been present at the beginning. Scenario 2, multiple opponents, 3 hostiles, varied species characteristics, coordinated attack patterns. The observation gallery had fallen completely silent. Even the species that communicated through sound, light, or pheromone patterns had ceased their normal chatter. The efficiency of the humans' performance had been unsettling, but more disturbing was the complete absence of emotional response to violence that should have been traumatic. Veltar found himself reassessing everything he thought he knew about human psychology. The female had engaged in combat with the same methodical competence she displayed eating her meal or attending classes. For his people, physical conflict required significant emotional preparation and recovery time. The human showed neither elevation nor aftermath, simply professional execution followed by immediate readiness for the next challenge. The second scenario materialized 3 opponents with different species characteristics, a construct resembling the crystal-shelled shard people with their sonic attack capabilities, an artificial drift dancer with aerial mobility advantages, and a simulation of his own people's combat form with its emphasis on reach and precision strikes. Multiple opponent scenarios typically overwhelmed individual fighters through coordination and simultaneous pressure from different directions. Academy doctrine taught defensive positioning, tactical withdrawal, and attempts to isolate opponents for individual engagement. Students who attempted to engage multiple hostiles simultaneously usually found themselves quickly defeated as their attention became divided and their defensive options eliminated. Jennifer's approach violated every principle of sound tactical doctrine, yet somehow worked. Instead of attempting to maintain defensive positioning against 3 opponents, she used their coordination against them. When the Zephyrian construct attempted its precise strike pattern, she guided its attack into the path of the Shard Person construct's sonic assault, disrupting both opponents' attack sequences while positioning herself to engage the Drift Dancer before it could utilize its mobility advantages effectively. The engagement flowed like a deadly dance, with the human seeming to anticipate not just individual opponent actions, but their coordination patterns. Her movements suggested combat experience against multiple hostiles was familiar territory rather than theoretical knowledge, and her weapon work demonstrated training that went far beyond academy instruction. Scenario 2 complete, Graulich announced. Final scenario: environmental hazard response during hostile contact. The third scenario was designed to test adaptation under pressure, how effectively cadets could function when environmental dangers complicated combat situations. The training floor reconfigured into a damaged spacecraft environment with failing life support, emergency lighting, and obstacles that could provide cover or create additional hazards. A single opponent construct appeared, but the real challenge lay in managing atmospheric pressure loss, failing gravity systems, and emergency conditions that would overwhelm most beings' ability to function effectively. Students typically focused so heavily on environmental survival that their combat performance degraded significantly, or concentrated so intensely on the opponent that they failed to manage life support requirements properly. The human female treated the complex scenario as if it were routine. Her movements through the hazardous environment showed familiarity with emergency conditions that went beyond simulation training. She used atmospheric pressure changes to enhance weapon effectiveness, manipulated failing gravity to redirect her opponent's attacks, and maintained perfect awareness of life support requirements while engaging in deadly combat. Most disturbing to the observing aliens was her obvious comfort with conditions that should have been terrifying. The scenario was designed to be stressful, pushing cadets to their limits while teaching them to function under pressure. The human showed no stress indicators at all, merely professional competence in an environment she clearly found familiar. All scenarios complete, Graulich announced as the training floor returned to normal configuration. Assessment results will be available through standard channels. As Jennifer completed her equipment return procedures, the observation gallery remained silent. Each species present was processing what they had witnessed through their own evolutionary and cultural frameworks, and none of those frameworks provided adequate explanation for what they had observed. The human had demonstrated combat effectiveness that exceeded most species' capabilities, but more unsettling was her emotional response to violence that should have been traumatic. For beings whose psychological development emphasized cooperation, social harmony, and conflict avoidance, the casual competence she displayed suggested a form of consciousness that operated according to entirely different principles. Dr. Keshala's mental presence registered the disturbed confusion rippling through the gathered aliens. "How many of you," she asked quietly, "are beginning to understand that human psychological patterns might represent successful adaptation to conditions you've never experienced?" The question hung in the air as cadets began filing out of the observation area. The evening's demonstration had provided answers to some questions while raising others that were far more troubling. If the human's combat performance represented normal capability rather than exceptional training, what did that suggest about her species' evolutionary background? And if her scar truly represented personal achievement rather than trauma, what had she achieved that required marking herself permanently to remember? The Academy's Xenoarchaeology department occupied an entire wing of the research complex, its laboratories filled with artifacts from civilizations that had risen and fallen across the galaxy's long history. Professor Thisara, one of the Eternal Watchers whose species had observed galactic civilization for millennia, maintained the department's most sensitive collections, items too dangerous or valuable for standard academic access. 3 days after the combat assessment, she found herself examining a request for research access that challenged several Academy protocols simultaneously. Human Cadet Holland was seeking permission to access records related to what the database classified as void war artifacts, materials from conflicts so ancient and destructive that most species preferred to pretend they had never occurred. The Void Wars represented a dark period in galactic history when species had engaged in total warfare using weapons and techniques that violated every principle of civilized conflict. Most races had collectively agreed to seal those records, considering the knowledge too dangerous for contemporary access. The few remaining artifacts were studied only by senior researchers with specialized clearances and psychological stability evaluations. That a first-year cadet would request such access was unusual. That she would do so with proper authorization codes and research justifications was unprecedented. Professor Thisara's three-chambered brain processed the implications, while her sensory apparatus reviewed the formal request documentation. Her species had evolved to observe rather than participate, making them ideal keepers of dangerous knowledge, but even the Eternal Watchers approached Void War materials with careful respect. The authorization codes were authentic, military clearances that shouldn't exist in Academy databases, issued by organizations that maintained their own classification systems independent of educational institutions. The research justification was professionally written and academically sound, requesting access to specific artifact categories related to personal equipment used by extinct human Void War units. What made the request truly puzzling was its specificity. Rather than seeking general historical information, the human was looking for detailed technical specifications for equipment used by military units that had been destroyed centuries before current galactic civilization achieved its present form. An hour later, Professor Thisara found herself in conversation with Dr. Keshala and Instructor Gralek, the three of them reviewing classified materials in a secured conference room that prevented electronic surveillance or telepathic monitoring. "The authorization codes check out," Gralek confirmed, his 4 eyes focusing on different sections of the documentation simultaneously. "They're issued by Human Defense Command, an organization that officially doesn't exist according to current galactic records." Dr. Keshala's mental presence conveyed troubled confusion. The psychological profile indicators suggest she's seeking confirmation of existing knowledge rather than acquiring new information. This isn't research curiosity, it's verification. Professor Thisara manipulated the holographic display to show artifact images that hadn't been accessed in decades. The specific equipment she's requesting matches items recovered from Void War battlefields on 17 different worlds. Combat gear designed for operations in environments that would kill most species within minutes. The 3 instructors studied images of equipment that represented technological capabilities their current civilization couldn't reproduce. Personal armor systems that could function in hard vacuum, atmospheric extremes, and radiation levels that would sterilize most planets. Weapons designed to penetrate defenses that no longer existed. Life support systems built for conflicts where survival meant continuing to fight long after normal beings would have died. "The implications are troubling," Dr. Keshala observed. "If she has legitimate access to these authorization codes, it suggests connections to military organizations that exist outside normal galactic oversight. If she doesn't, the security breach represents a threat to Academy operations." Gralek's combat experience provided a different perspective. The combat assessment 3 days ago demonstrated familiarity with conditions that match Void War environmental descriptions. Emergency operations in failing life support, combat effectiveness under extreme stress, psychological stability in situations designed to overwhelm normal consciousness. Professor Thaisara accessed additional files that required her personal biometric confirmation to view. There are gaps in human historical records that correspond to void war periods. Most species have complete documentation of their development during those centuries. Human databases show what scholars have assumed were technological limitations preventing proper record-keeping, or deliberate concealment of activities that contemporary human government prefers to keep classified, Dr. Keshala suggested. Species don't typically develop military authorization systems for conflicts that never occurred. The secured conference room's environmental controls created perfect conditions for each species present, but the information they were reviewing generated discomfort that transcended physical considerations. The possibility that humans had been active participants in conflicts that predated current galactic civilization suggested a history far more complex and dangerous than Academy records indicated. "We need to make a decision about her request," Professor Thaisara noted. "The authorization codes are valid, the research justification meets academic standards, and Academy policy requires approval of properly documented access requests. While considering that approval might provide her with information that confirms military capabilities we prefer to believe no longer exist," Gralek added grimly. Dr. Keshala's telepathic abilities detected the emotional undertones of their discussion: fear, curiosity, and the intellectual honesty that demanded acknowledging uncomfortable truths. There's another consideration. If her interest stems from personal connection to this history, denial of access might prompt investigation through less controlled channels. The three instructors spent another hour reviewing implications before reaching consensus. Professor Thaisara would approve the request under enhanced monitoring protocols, with full documentation of accessed materials and behavioral observation throughout the research session. Dr. Keshala would maintain telepathic presence to monitor psychological responses, while Gralek would provide security oversight in case the information triggered unexpected reactions. 2 hours later, human Cadet Holland entered the secured research facility with the same methodical composure she demonstrated in every other Academy activity. Her response to the extraordinary security measures was professional acknowledgement rather than curiosity, suggesting familiarity with classified research protocols that went beyond standard Academy training. Professor Thaisara observed her initial reaction to the Void War artifacts with the trained attention of someone whose species had perfected the art of watching without interfering. The human's response was immediate and unsettling, not the academic fascination expected from a student encountering historical materials, but the recognition of someone seeing familiar equipment. Her fingers traced the holographic display, showing a piece of personal armor designed for extended operations in hostile environments, and her expression shifted into something that made Dr. Keshala's telepathic monitoring register alarm. The psychological patterns weren't those of a student studying historical artifacts, but of a veteran examining equipment she had used. "This is Mark 7 environmental armor," Jennifer said quietly, her voice carrying technical familiarity that shouldn't exist in Academy databases. "Thermal regulation rated for plus or minus 200 degrees Celsius, radiation shielding effective against Class 9 stellar emissions, integrated life support capable of maintaining function for 72 hours in hard vacuum." The three instructors exchanged glances that conveyed their shared realization that the human's knowledge went far beyond academic research. Her specifications matched classified technical manuals that weren't available through normal educational channels. "Cadet," Professor Thaisara began carefully, "where did you encounter information about these technical specifications?" "Personal experience," Jennifer replied without hesitation, her attention still focused on the holographic displays. "Though I wore Mark 9 gear, the thermal regulation was improved and the radiation shielding was upgraded to handle Class 12 emissions." She paused, studying another artifact. "We needed the extra protection." Dr. Keshala's mental presence registered shock from all three instructors simultaneously. The Mark 9 designation didn't exist in any database they could access, and Class 12 stellar emissions were theoretical energy levels that current science considered lethal to any known form of life. Personal experience, Gralek repeated slowly, his four eyes focusing intently on the human. Are you claiming direct familiarity with Void War equipment? I'm not claiming anything, Jennifer said, moving to examine another display showing weapon systems. I'm stating facts. This is a Mark 6 plasma rifle, effective range approximately 800 meters in atmosphere, designed for penetrating enhanced defensive systems. Rate of fire limited by thermal buildup, about 40 shots before mandatory cooling cycle. Her casual recitation of technical specifications that existed in no contemporary database created silence that stretched beyond normal conversation pauses. The implications of her knowledge challenged fundamental assumptions about human history, current galactic civilization, and the relationship between past and present. Professor Thisara accessed another restricted file, displaying equipment that represented the most advanced technology recovered from Void War sites. Can you identify this artifact, Cadet? The holographic display showed a device that had puzzled xenoarchaeologists for decades, a piece of personal equipment whose function remained unclear despite extensive analysis. Its design suggested advanced technology, but no contemporary science could explain its operational principles. Jennifer studied the image for several seconds before responding. Field medical kit, designed for treating injuries that conventional medicine couldn't handle. Neural interface surgery, genetic damage repair, psychological trauma suppression. Her finger indicated specific components. This section handles cellular regeneration at the molecular level. That part suppresses pain response during conscious surgery. The neural interface components allow direct treatment of brain injuries that would normally be fatal. Impossible, Dr. Keshala said, her telepathic abilities detecting no deception in the human's responses. Current medical technology cannot achieve those capabilities. Current medical technology, Jennifer agreed, but we weren't operating under current limitations. She turned away from the displays to face the three instructors directly. The Void Wars weren't fought by current galactic civilization. They were fought by people who had to develop capabilities that your species never needed. The statement hung in the air like a challenge to everything the Academy taught about historical development and technological progress. The idea that previous human civilization had achieved capabilities that exceeded current galactic standards violated basic assumptions about linear advancement. Gralek's combat experience provided context that his colleagues lacked. Are you suggesting that human military capability during the Void Wars exceeded current standards? I'm stating that human military capability during the Void Wars was designed to fight enemies that current galactic civilization couldn't comprehend, Jennifer replied. Threats that required individual soldiers to function as complete military units, capable of operating independently for months or years without resupply, support, or communication. Professor Thisara accessed the most restricted files in her collection, materials that required unanimous approval from the Academy's governing council to view. If your claims are accurate, you should be able to identify the purpose of this artifact. The new holographic display showed something that had been recovered from the most devastating Void War battlefield sites, a device so alien in design that no species had been able to determine its function or origin. Xenoarchaeologists had classified it as unknown technology, possibly non-terrestrial origin. Jennifer looked at the display and smiled, and that expression contained more menace than any threat display the instructors had previously encountered. That's not an artifact, she said quietly. That's a memorial. The silence that followed contained a quality of revelation that transcended normal academic discovery. Dr. Keshala's telepathic monitoring registered profound shifts in understanding from all three instructors as implications cascaded through their consciousness. A memorial to what? Professor Thisara asked, though her ancient wisdom suggested she might not want to know the answer. To the Devourers, Jennifer replied, her finger tracing the scar along her temple in an unconscious gesture. The enemy that required us to become what we became. The threat that made the Void Wars necessary. She looked directly at each instructor in turn. The species that we hunted to extinction before they could finish consuming the galaxy. The research facility's environmental controls continued maintaining perfect conditions for each species present, but the information being revealed created an atmosphere that transcended physical comfort. The humans' casual reference to genocide, committed by her own species against an enemy so dangerous that their existence had been erased from historical records, challenged every principle of contemporary galactic civilization. The humans fought a war of extinction. Dr. Keshala's telepathic presence conveyed horror that translated across species barriers. The humans fought a war of survival, Jennifer corrected. The Devourers didn't want territory, resources, or political control. They wanted to consume every form of intelligent life in the galaxy, converting organic matter into extensions of their collective consciousness. Negotiation wasn't possible because they didn't recognize individual existence as valid. Gralek's military training provided context for understanding warfare, but the scale she was describing exceeded his conceptual frameworks. Total warfare against an extinction-level threat. Total warfare against an enemy that had already consumed 17 star systems before we encountered them, Jennifer said. An enemy that converted conquered populations into weapons against their former allies. An enemy that learned from every engagement, adapted to every strategy, and grew stronger with every victory. Professor Thisara's three-chambered brain processed the implications, while her sensory apparatus detected changes in the human's biometric readings. And you have personal knowledge of these conflicts? I have personal knowledge of cleaning up after these conflicts, Jennifer replied. Void War veterans didn't all die in the fighting. Some of us survived to make sure the threat was completely eliminated. Her finger traced the scar again, and the gesture carried ritualistic significance that the watching aliens couldn't interpret. That mark, Dr. Keshala said suddenly, understanding flooding through her telepathic awareness. It represents participation in post-war operations. It represents a kill that took too long, Jennifer said, echoing the words that had started the entire investigation. The last Devourer facility we found had been dormant for 3 years before we located it. The entity inside had been isolated, starving, trying to maintain consciousness without access to fresh organic matter to consume. The 3 instructors waited for her to continue, recognizing that they were about to learn something that would change their understanding of human nature permanently. Standard procedure was immediate elimination of any Devourer remnants, she continued. But this one had information we needed, the locations of other dormant facilities that might still contain active threats. The interrogation took 6 months. Her hand moved to the scar again. 6 months of keeping a dying monster alive while extracting information that would save billions of lives. And the mark? Professor Thisara asked. The mark is what's left of the neural interface connection, Jennifer said simply. When you interrogate something that exists as pure consuming hunger, part of it stays with you. The scar reminds me what I'm willing to do to protect people who sleep safely because they never had to make those choices. The silence that followed contained the weight of revelation that transcended academic discovery. The 3 instructors found themselves confronting the reality that their comfortable galactic civilization existed because humans had been willing to become monsters to fight worse monsters. Dr. Keshala's telepathic abilities detected no deception, no exaggeration, no psychological instability in the humans' responses. The story was truth delivered with the matter-of-fact tone of someone reporting routine professional experience. How many others know this history? Gralek asked. Enough, Jennifer replied. Human Defense Command maintains operational readiness for threats that current galactic civilization prefers to believe don't exist. We study at your academy, serve in your diplomatic corps, participate in your scientific research, but we also remember what it cost to build the peace you take for granted. Professor Thisara recognized the moment when academic curiosity transformed into something larger and more dangerous. And if such threats emerged again, then you would discover why humans seem psychologically adapted for violence that other species find incomprehensible, Jennifer said. Because we've been preparing for another war like that since the day the last one ended. The Academy's central plaza served as neutral ground where cadets from all species could gather for informal social interaction outside the structured environment of classes and training. Late evening hours typically found small groups engaged in cross-cultural discussions, recreational activities, or quiet study in the carefully maintained environment that accommodated dozens of different atmospheric and gravitational preferences. Tonight, however, the plaza buzzed with conversations that had nothing to do with academic pursuits. Word of the humans' research session had spread through the informal communication networks that every educational institution developed, and speculation about her discoveries had reached fever pitch among the student body. Cadet Veltar found himself at the center of one such discussion, his tall form surrounded by representatives from multiple species seeking his perspective on the morning's revelations. As the individual who had initiated the original confrontation, his insights were considered particularly valuable by his fellow students. The humans' claims challenge fundamental assumptions about galactic historical development, observed Cadet Zixandra of the Pattern Weavers, her crystalline form refracting the plaza's ambient lighting into complex geometric shapes. If accurate, they suggest that current civilization exists because of conflicts we have no knowledge of. The symmetrical ones had arranged themselves in perfect mathematical harmony while discussing the implications of humanity's hidden history. Their representative, speaking through harmonic frequencies that required translation, conveyed their species' distress at discovering such massive discontinuities in historical records. Information asymmetry of this magnitude represents fundamental instability in our understanding of galactic development, the translation rendered their harmonic communication. If humans possess knowledge of extinct threats that current civilization cannot access, our strategic planning operates from incomplete data sets. Thexalon's massive form dominated the specialized seating area designed for Kraknari physiology, his compound eyes tracking the discussion with predatory intensity. Unlike many of his colleagues, his warrior culture provided frameworks for understanding the concepts Jennifer had revealed. The human speaks of warfare concepts that my people recognize but hoped had been transcended by galactic civilization, he rumbled through his translation interface. Total warfare against extinction threats. Individual soldiers trained for independent operation during extended campaigns. Population-level commitment to military objectives that supersede normal ethical constraints. The ethereal collective members floated in their mobility harnesses, their bioluminescent communication, creating light patterns that conveyed profound disturbance. Their telepathic network had been processing the implications since the research session ended, and their collective consciousness struggled to incorporate concepts that violated their fundamental assumptions about intelligent behavior. The human psychological patterns now make coherent sense, their representative explained through bioluminescent translation. What we interpreted as primitive emotional instability was actually enhanced stress response capability. What appeared to be individual aggression was training for scenarios requiring personal violence in service of species survival. Dr. Keshala approached the gathering with the deliberate pace of someone whose telepathic abilities allowed her to monitor the emotional atmosphere before arriving physically. The mixture of fascination, fear, and re-evaluation she detected suggested that the student body was processing revelations that challenged their worldview at fundamental levels. "I see you're discussing this afternoon's research session," she observed, settling into her specialized mobility apparatus. "How many of you are beginning to understand that your initial assessments of human behavior might have been based on incomplete information?" Veltar's melodic voice carried a note of intellectual humility that hadn't been present in his earlier interactions. "Doctor, we find ourselves reconsidering assumptions we hadn't realized we were making. If humans developed psychological adaptations for conflicts that other species never experienced, our evaluation criteria were fundamentally inappropriate. More troubling," added Cadet Morthek of the Deep Thinkers, whose species specialized in long-term strategic analysis, "is the implication that current galactic peace might depend on human military capabilities that operate outside normal diplomatic oversight." The observation sparked renewed discussion as each species processed the concept through their own evolutionary and cultural frameworks. For beings whose societies had developed through cooperation and technological advancement, the idea that their security depended on another species' willingness to engage in violence they couldn't comprehend was deeply unsettling. Professor Gralek arrived as the discussion reached its peak intensity, his four eyes immediately cataloging the emotional states and group dynamics of the gathered students. His combat experience provided perspectives that most academy instructors lacked, making his insights particularly valuable for understanding the implications of recent revelations. "The humans' demonstration 3 nights ago takes on new significance given this context," he observed, his massive frame commanding immediate attention. What we interpreted as exceptional individual performance was actually baseline capability for someone trained to function independently against extinction-level threats. The statement created uncomfortable silence as its implications registered with the gathered aliens. If Jennifer's combat effectiveness represented normal human military capability rather than exceptional training, the strategic implications challenged their understanding of galactic power dynamics. Cadet Jorik of the Stone Shepherds, known for his methodical analysis and reluctance to engage in speculation, posed the question that others had been avoiding. Are we to understand that humans maintain military capabilities that exceed current galactic standards while participating in our educational and diplomatic institutions? Are we to understand, Dr. Keshala replied, that you're surprised to discover that species survival sometimes requires capabilities that peacetime civilization prefers not to acknowledge? The response reframed the discussion in ways that forced each species to examine their own assumptions about the relationship between individual capability and social cooperation. Most galactic civilizations had achieved advancement through specialization and interdependence, making the concept of individual soldiers capable of species-level military effectiveness both incomprehensible and threatening. "The human female Scar," observed one of the chorus singers, their harmonic communication creating sounds like distant music, "represents achievement that our cultural frameworks cannot properly evaluate. We interpret permanent self-modification as either punishment or decoration, but her mark indicates experience that transcends those categories." "It represents transition," Professor Gralek corrected, "the mark of someone who crossed lines that can't be uncrossed, who accepted responsibilities that change fundamental aspects of personal identity." The gathered students stirred uneasily as they contemplated the implications. For species whose development emphasized gradual growth and social harmony, the concept of transformative experience that permanently altered individual psychology was both fascinating and disturbing. As the evening progressed, conversations shifted from speculation about human history to more immediate concerns about the implications for their own futures. If humans possessed knowledge and capabilities that exceeded current galactic standards, what did that suggest about the effectiveness of academy training for preparing cadets to function in the real galaxy? "We must consider," suggested Cadet Zaraneth of the Shard People, her crystalline form resonating with harmonic patterns that conveyed deep concern, whether our educational framework provides adequate preparation for realities that human knowledge suggests we haven't properly understood. The question resonated through the gathered aliens with uncomfortable accuracy. Academy training emphasized cooperation, diplomatic solutions, and technological approaches to problem-solving. If the galaxy contained threats that required individual violence capabilities that most species couldn't develop, their education might be fundamentally inadequate for the challenges they would face after graduation. Dr. Keshala detected the shift in emotional atmosphere as the students moved from curiosity about human nature to anxiety about their own preparedness. "How many of you," she asked quietly, "are beginning to understand that safety sometimes depends on others' willingness to do things you couldn't do yourself?" The observation created contemplative silence as each species processed the concept through their own evolutionary frameworks. For beings whose survival had depended on cooperation and mutual support, the idea of owing their security to individuals capable of violence they couldn't comprehend challenged their understanding of civilized society. The human speaks of preparing for threats that current civilization prefers to believe don't exist, noted Thexalon, his warrior culture providing context for understanding military readiness concepts. This suggests that galactic peace might be more fragile than our educational institutions acknowledge. Professor Gralek's combat experience allowed him to recognize patterns that his academic colleagues missed. Peace maintained through strength isn't the same as peace achieved through understanding. The human's presence here suggests that her people consider academy relationships important enough to maintain despite significant operational security risks. The implication sparked renewed discussion about human motivations for participating in galactic educational institutions. If they possessed military capabilities that exceeded academy standards and knowledge of threats that other species couldn't access, their investment in cross-cultural education suggested strategic thinking that operated on timescales most aliens found difficult to comprehend. As the gathering began to disperse, individual conversations continued in smaller groups, each species processing the revelations through their own cultural and evolutionary frameworks. The comfortable assumptions about human nature that had dominated Academy social dynamics for decades had been replaced by recognition that their Earth-born colleagues might represent something far more complex and potentially dangerous than anyone had realized. For the first time since the Academy's founding, students from across the galaxy found themselves questioning not just what they knew about humans, but what they didn't know about the universe they thought they understood. 3 weeks after the research session, the Academy's annual diplomatic simulation exercise brought together cadets from every species in a comprehensive scenario designed to test their ability to function effectively in complex political situations. The exercise traditionally featured multiple competing factions, limited resources, shifting alliances, and crisis events that required immediate collaborative responses. This year's scenario involved first contact protocols with a newly discovered species whose initial communications suggested both advanced technology and hostile intentions toward galactic civilization. Cadet teams were assigned roles representing different aspects of diplomatic response: first contact specialists, military advisors, cultural analysts, and negotiation coordinators. The exercise took place in the Academy's holographic simulation complex, a facility capable of creating fully immersive environments that could accommodate the physical and psychological requirements of multiple species simultaneously. For the next 48 hours, cadets would experience realistic diplomatic pressure while their instructors monitored performance and evaluated cross-species cooperation capabilities. Human Cadet Holland had been assigned to the military advisory team, a decision that several alien cadets privately questioned given recent revelations about her background. Her colleagues included Veltar as diplomatic protocol specialist, Thexalon as tactical analyst, and representatives from 6 other species whose combined expertise should have provided comprehensive strategic assessment capabilities. The scenario began with standard first contact protocols, cautious communication attempts, analysis of alien technology demonstrations, and careful evaluation of cultural indicators that might provide insight into the unknown species' intentions and capabilities. Initial responses suggested a civilization roughly equivalent to current galactic standards, with technology that operated on familiar principles and social structures that seemed comprehensible through existing xenosociological frameworks. 6 hours into the exercise, the situation changed dramatically. The simulated alien species revealed capabilities that exceeded all initial assessments, deploying weapon systems that could destroy entire star systems and demonstrating tactical knowledge that suggested extensive observation of galactic civilization. Their demands shifted from diplomatic contact to ultimatum: submit to incorporation into their expanding empire or face systematic elimination. The exercise's AI systems, programmed to create realistic political pressure, began generating crisis scenarios faster than the cadet teams could process them. Colony worlds reported attacks by weapons that penetrated all known defensive systems. Communication networks failed as alien technology disrupted galactic infrastructure. Military forces deployed to defensive positions found themselves outmaneuvered by enemies who seemed to anticipate every strategic response. Within the simulation complex, the various cadet teams struggled to maintain coordination as their carefully planned diplomatic strategies collapsed under pressure that exceeded their training parameters. Species that excelled at technological solutions found their advantages neutralized by alien capabilities they couldn't understand. Diplomatic specialists discovered that their negotiation techniques had no effect on entities whose demands weren't open to compromise. At the military advisory station, Jennifer watched the developing crisis with an expression that made her alien colleagues increasingly uncomfortable. While they frantically consulted databases and attempted to develop responses to threats that exceeded their conceptual frameworks, she displayed the same professional competence she had shown during combat training. "Cadet Holland," Veltar said, his melodic voice carrying stress indicators that hadn't been present at the exercise's beginning, "the hostile capabilities exceed our analytical models. Standard defensive protocols appear inadequate for the technological advantages they're demonstrating." "Standard defensive protocols are designed for conflicts between comparable civilizations," Jennifer replied, without taking her attention from the strategic displays. "They don't apply when facing extinction-level threats." Thexalon's compound eyes focused on her with predatory intensity. "Are you suggesting that this scenario represents the type of threat your people prepared for during the Void Wars?" "I'm stating that this scenario represents a significantly reduced version of the threats my people successfully eliminated during the Void Wars," she corrected. "The simulation parameters have been adjusted for training purposes." Real Devourer capabilities were considerably more dangerous. The casual confidence in her voice created silence among her team members as they processed the implications. If the crisis scenario that was overwhelming their analytical capabilities represented a diminished version of threats that humans had actually faced, their educational preparation was fundamentally inadequate for understanding real galactic dangers. "What response do you recommend?" asked Cadet Shental of the phase shifters, her partially solid form flickering with stress patterns that made her difficult to observe directly. "Total warfare," Jennifer replied without hesitation. "Immediate mobilization of all available resources for complete elimination of the hostile species. No negotiation, no territorial compromise, no hope for coexistence. Extinction warfare using every available capability." The recommendation violated every principle of diplomatic education the Academy had taught them. The idea of species-level genocide as a first response option challenged their fundamental assumptions about civilized conflict resolution. "Surely," Veltar protested. There must be diplomatic alternatives to consider. Total warfare should be a last resort after exhausting peaceful options. Peaceful options are luxuries available when facing opponents who share basic assumptions about individual survival value, Jennifer explained patiently. When facing extinction threats, peaceful options become suicide by delay. Her words carried the authority of someone describing practical experience rather than theoretical knowledge, and her team members found themselves confronting the possibility that their educational training had never addressed the most dangerous categories of threat. The simulation continued to deteriorate as cadet teams across the complex struggled with scenarios that exceeded their preparation. Communication between teams broke down as crisis events overwhelmed their coordination capabilities. Strategic planning became impossible as hostile actions disrupted every defensive measure they attempted to implement. In the observation areas, Academy instructors monitored the exercise with growing concern. The scenario's AI systems were generating more complex challenges than anticipated, and the cadet response patterns suggested that their educational framework might have significant gaps in preparing students for extreme crisis situations. Dr. Keshala's telepathic monitoring detected rising panic among the alien cadets as they confronted scenarios that challenged their species' basic assumptions about conflict and survival. The psychological stress indicators were approaching levels that might require exercise termination to prevent lasting trauma. Professor Gralek's 4 eyes tracked tactical displays that showed the simulated galactic civilization facing systematic destruction despite the combined efforts of teams representing the most advanced species in current society. The exercise parameters exceed normal training thresholds, he observed. Student performance is degrading as scenario complexity increases beyond their analytical capabilities. Perhaps, suggested Professor Thisara, we should observe how the human responds to scenarios that match the threats she claims to have experience with. At the military advisory station, Jennifer had taken effective control of strategic planning as her alien colleagues struggled to process information that overwhelmed their conceptual frameworks. Her approach to the crisis scenario violated Academy doctrine, but demonstrated competence that suggested extensive experience with similar situations. Veltar, I need you to coordinate with the diplomatic teams and inform them that negotiation is no longer an option, she said, her voice carrying command authority that hadn't been present during normal Academy interactions. Thexalon, contact the tactical groups and tell them to abandon defensive positioning. We're switching to elimination protocols. Cadet, Veltar protested, we cannot simply abandon diplomatic alternatives without proper— We can and we will, Jennifer interrupted, her tone suggesting that discussion was no longer welcome. This is an extinction scenario. Standard protocols don't apply. Either we eliminate the threat completely or our civilization ends. Those are the only options. The transformation in her demeanor was striking enough to draw attention from other cadet teams struggling with their own crisis management. The calm, methodical student who had endured months of casual condescension had been replaced by someone whose psychological patterns suggested extensive leadership experience under extreme pressure. How do we implement elimination protocols against a species that demonstrates technological superiority? Asked Cadet Morthek of the Deep Thinkers, his strategic analysis capabilities overwhelmed by the scenario's complexity. By accepting casualties and time frames that peaceful civilizations find unacceptable, Jennifer replied, accessing simulation controls that most cadets didn't know existed. By committing to total warfare that continues until one species no longer exists. Her manipulation of the exercise systems revealed knowledge of Academy capabilities that exceeded normal student access. Within minutes, she had coordinated responses between teams that had been struggling to communicate effectively, implemented strategic frameworks that none of the other cadets recognized, and began systematic elimination of the hostile species using methods that violated every principle of civilized warfare. The alien cadets watched with fascination and horror as she demonstrated military effectiveness that exceeded their educational preparation while employing tactical concepts that challenged their understanding of acceptable behavior. Her approach to the extinction scenario was both successful and deeply disturbing, suggesting psychological adaptations that most species couldn't develop. As the exercise reached its conclusion, with the complete elimination of the simulated hostile species, the cadet teams found themselves confronting uncomfortable questions about their own preparedness for real galactic threats. If scenarios requiring individual violence capabilities could overwhelm their analytical frameworks, their education might be inadequate for the universe they would face after graduation. In the observation area, the Academy instructors reviewed performance data that challenged their assumptions about educational effectiveness and student capability. The humans' response to extreme crisis scenarios had demonstrated competence that exceeded their evaluation criteria while raising questions about the relationship between individual preparation and species survival. The exercise results suggest, Dr. Keshala observed, that our educational framework may need significant revision to address threat categories that current curriculum doesn't acknowledge. Professor Gralek's military experience provided context for understanding the implications. The human's performance indicates training for scenarios that our other students couldn't comprehend. If such threats exist in the real galaxy, our graduates are unprepared for effective response. As cadets filed out of the simulation complex, conversations focused on the disturbing recognition that their comfortable assumptions about galactic civilization might be based on security provided by others' willingness to do things they couldn't do themselves. The human female who had seemed like an evolutionary curiosity 3 weeks earlier now represented something far more complex and potentially necessary, a reminder that peace sometimes required others to bear burdens that civilized society preferred not to acknowledge. The scar along her temple, the mark she had called a kill that took too long, suddenly seemed less like primitive decoration and more like the badge of someone who had crossed lines that others couldn't cross to protect people who would never understand what that sacrifice had cost. As she walked away from the simulation complex, her posture carried the same methodical competence she had displayed throughout her academy career, but now her alien colleagues understood that her confidence came not from ignorance of danger, but from extensive experience with threats that would destroy them. And in the quiet conversations that followed, cadets from across the galaxy found themselves asking questions they had never needed to ask before. What else didn't they know about the universe they lived in? What other threats required capabilities they couldn't develop? And how many humans like Jennifer Holland were quietly stationed throughout galactic civilization, preparing for wars that everyone else hoped would never come? The Academy's mission was to prepare cadets for effective service in galactic society. But as they left the simulation complex that evening, students from dozens of species realized they might have been training for a version of reality that existed only because others were willing to live in a darker, more dangerous universe where individual conscience became secondary to species survival. The mark on her neck was beginning to make sense, not as decoration or punishment, but as a reminder of prices paid and lines crossed in service of a peace that others could take for granted only because they never had to understand what it really cost.